This is audio from the platform. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. This is from the platform. To the room, please respond.
Oh, hi. There's one, yeah.
Testing 1, 2. Will someone in the hearing room please open a microphone and give me a 5 count?
Hello, can you hear me? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Affirmative, I can hear you on the platform.
Unclear. Why?
Yeah, we just want to check.
Can you hear me in the room, Jessica?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can hear you. Go ahead. All right, I'm gonna start. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The
Before
subcommittee
this
on
hearing begins, I'd like to remind members per guidance from the Office of Attending Physician to please continue wearing masks even when you are speaking if you are in the committee room. This is not only for your safety, but for the safety of others. Now I'd like to pass along some notes about the system we are using today. This hearing is being recorded. Each virtual participant has a control bar at the bottom of their screen that includes a mute button and a video on-off button. The view control buttons in the upper right of your screen control your personal view and be switched between active speaker with thumbnails, and grid view. This is your individual view and will not affect anyone else or what the public would see during an official proceeding. Please note that the system's active speaker view will automatically switch to your camera a few moments after you begin speaking. A timekeeper will monitor the time for this hearing. For members joining in the committee room, the timer can be viewed on the dais. For members joining remotely, please change your personal view to active speaker view. You can pin the timer by right-clicking or hovering your cursor over the timer and pressing the thumbtack icon. If you would like to insert anything into the record, please have your staff email the document to hvac.repository@mail.house.gov. This email was distributed to your staff in advance of this hearing. In a moment, the host will mute all participants other than Chairman Castro. All participants are asked to keep themselves muted when not actively engaging in discussion, which should help limit echoes or other disruptions. In instances in which members yield back or otherwise conclude their turn speaking, but do not remember to remute themselves, the host will mute them as to limit inadvertent background audio. Members and witnesses are responsible for unmuting themselves anytime they wish to be heard. With that, we are ready to begin. Chairman Castro, please count down from 5 so the system displays your video. Pause briefly while the recording begins and then start the proceeding.
All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global
This meeting is being recorded.
Global Corporate Social Impact will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today and for our hearing entitled Innovation and Development Policy, Maximizing Impact and Results. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the document to the previously mentioned address or contact subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members, staff, and all others physically present in this room, per recent guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's hearing, including when speaking. Please also sanitize your seating area. The chair views these measures as a safety issue and therefore an important matter of order and decorum for this proceeding. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 8 and accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Thank you all for joining us today for this hearing, where this subcommittee will look at the role innovation plays in achieving a more effective development policy. U.S. leadership on development assistance has a long bipartisan tradition. The work of USAID, the State Department, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and our other agencies has helped millions of people across the world. We're going to have to pause because there's an issue with the audio.
This meeting is being recorded.
Testing, testing. You need to lower the volume on that. All right, y'all, we're going to start over again because of the audio. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today for this hearing entitled Innovation and Development Policy, Maximizing Impact and Results. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the document to the previously mentioned address or contact subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members, staff, and all others physically present in the room, per recent guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's hearing, including when speaking. Please also sanitize your seating area. The Chair views these measures as a safety issue and therefore an important matter of order and decorum for this proceeding. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the Chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRS 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I'll now recognize myself for opening remarks. Thank you all for joining us today for this hearing, where this subcommittee will look at the role innovation plays in achieving a more effective development policy. U.S. leadership on development assistance has a long and bipartisan tradition. The work of USAID, the State Department, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and our other agencies has helped millions of people across the world and are key parts of our foreign policy infrastructure. And the need for strengthening U.S. leadership in development is clear. The first hearing the subcommittee held last month laid out the dire impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on our development priorities. At our current pace, it will be nearly impossible for the world to reach the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Accelerating progress demands greater resources, which the administration has requested in their budget and this Congress will consider. But our development programs also need to become more efficient and effective. We must ensure that each dollar we invest goes as far as it possibly can, maximizing our impact per tax dollar and taking into account the best practices by innovation. We are only a few months into this new administration, which will have to decide what initiatives from the Trump administration they will continue and which ones they will reject. USAID, our nation's premier development agency, is now at the tail end of a significant reorganization led by former Administrator Mark Green, who is also a former member of this committee. I, like my colleagues, were broadly supportive of these efforts and the goals of expanding the use of innovation in all of USAID's activities. But this reorganization has also raised a number of questions that remain unresolved. That includes the dissolution of the Global Development Lab, an entity that was tasked with piloting innovative development policies, developing them, and scaling them up. In its stead, USAID has set up the Bureau of Democracy, Development, and Innovation and the Innovation, Technology, and Research Hub. We need to know how the lab's functions, which are now in different parts of USAID, are being prioritized. The work of the lab proved that we can innovate and we can change how we do development, increasing the reach and effectiveness of our foreign assistance programs. And let me give you just one example. In 2013, the lab's development innovation ventures worked with partners on the ground in India to pioneer a new model for education called, quote, teaching at the right level, unquote, to help students who have fallen behind to catch up by teaching to skill level rather than just to age. After proving the model works, this model was adopted by other USAID offices, UNICEF, foreign governments, and private foundations. Programs like DIV, which was pioneered by Nobel Prize-winning economist Michael Kremer, yield over $17 in social benefits for every $1 invested. It's essential that work like this at USAID and in our foreign assistance agencies continues, and that our capabilities for innovation, working with allies, and helping people's lives is strengthened. I've called this hearing for members of the subcommittee to hear from our expert witnesses on the role innovation needs to play in our development policy, to learn more about what has worked and what hasn't, and how we can ensure our development policy remains on the cutting edge. And that includes important questions. For example, what lessons have we learned from the lab? How do we make innovation more mainstreamed at USAID? What lessons can we learn from other countries and the private sector? How do we better coordinate with our allies on our shared development priorities? As Congress conducts oversight over USAID's innovation capabilities, especially under this new structure, what should we keep in mind? We have 3 distinguished witnesses that we'll hear from on this issue. Before introducing them, I'll turn it over to our ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Castro, for calling this important hearing. I want to thank our distinguished witnesses here today for agreeing to testify and discuss the critical topic with our subcommittee. There's no shortage of global challenges in need of creative and innovative solutions. This has only become more pressing as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to devastate vulnerable communities around the world, from rising poverty rates, food shortages, global school closures, and severe lack of access to health services. Innovative solutions are needed now more than ever. The United States plays a key role in driving innovation in development. As the lead donor of development and humanitarian aid around the world, the U.S. must also lead the way in developing, incentivizing, and integrating innovation in our foreign aid programs. This includes more creative ways to monitor and evaluate our assistance to make sure every dollar is achieving results. If we are serious about innovation, we must address some of the systematic challenges that hampers innovation. Often, bureaucratic systems and processes are not conducive to fostering innovation and working with creative new partners. Tried and true approaches are easier and less risky than pursuing in something new and innovative. The private sector is leading the way when it comes to innovation, particularly when it comes to data and analytics, geospatial mapping, machine learning, remote monitoring, and digital technology. These creative solutions are often developed and financed with support from development finance institutions like our own U.S. Development Finance Corporation, the Global Innovation Fund, and other impact investors. U.S. universities and research institutions, as well as local partners and NGOs, also have a key role to play. The challenge is scaling up these innovations to ensure that they are applied and mainstreamed into U.S. foreign assistance programs. The Global Development Lab was an important start and set the tone for USAID to pursue more creative solutions to critical development challenges. I'm encouraged by efforts to elevate innovation and research at USAID through the creation of the Bureau of Development, Democracy, and Innovation. Within this bureau, the Innovation, Technology, and Research Hub and the Private Sector Engagement Hub are among the entities tasked with carrying out this important work. In addition, the creation of the Private Sector Engagement Policy and the Digital Strategy were welcome efforts, but more must be done. Whether it is shoring up global supply chains, accessing remote communities with digital technology, using community-level data to track trends in migration, and scaling up agriculture and power sector innovations, there are no shortage of challenges to address. I look forward to this hearing and learning more from our witnesses as they share their expertise and provide concrete examples of cutting-edge innovation from their respective organizations, Global Development Lab, the Global Innovation Fund, and FRAME, and how these innovations have scaled up, made our aid more effective, and ultimately improved people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Malliotakis. I'll now introduce our distinguished witnesses. Our witnesses for today's hearing are Anmei Chang, who is the former Chief Innovation Officer at USAID, and the former executive director of the U.S. Global Development Lab at USAID. Alex Peterson-Zwain, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Innovation Fund, and Benjamin Leo, the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Frame. I will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. I'll first call on Ms. Chang for her testimony. Ms. Chang, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Malliotakis, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for convening this timely hearing. The disruption and setbacks of this past year have made innovation in our foreign assistance more essential than ever. We simply don't have good enough solutions for the size and scope of the problems we face today. We should see this not only as a challenge, but also an opportunity for America's preeminence in technology and innovation to shine. But what does innovation even mean? Sadly, many equate it with chasing after the next shiny new thing. In reality, innovation is simply a different way of working when we're seeking a big leap forward in delivering better results to more people. It's often not sexy. Rather, it can be a long, hard slog of taking risks, testing, iterating, and improving. I had the privilege of serving at USAID as Chief Innovation Officer and the first Executive Director of the U.S. Global Development Lab that was set up with a dual mission to produce breakthrough innovations and transform the way we do development. As the chairman referenced, one of the lab's flagship programs is Development Innovation Ventures, or DIV, which seeks potentially breakthrough solutions using a tiered evidence-based funding model. This is similar to how venture capital fuels innovation in the private sector. Rather than making a large upfront investment in something that's still unproven, DIV places lots of small, riskier bets, expecting many will fail, but then doubles down on what works. The good news is that this kind of smart risk-taking pays off. A recent study by Nobel laureate and DIV co-founder Michael Kramer concluded that early DIV investments have already generated at least $5 of social benefit for every dollar invested, many-fold more than the average development program. We have made strong progress across both Republican and Democratic administrations in harnessing innovation to maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of our foreign assistance. I'd like to offer 3 recommendations for how we can continue to expand on that work. First, while it's important to have protected space for experimentation with new ideas, it's also important to graduate successes so that all of our foreign assistance benefits from the latest best practices. USAID has taken significant steps in this direction, and Congress could further accelerate the adoption of the transformative tools essential to today's dynamic environment by authorizing a Chief Innovation Officer and a Chief Digital Officer at each of our development agencies. Secondly, as the lab's original work matures, it can only continue to fulfill its mission if flexible space is created for the next generation of breakthroughs. Unfortunately, the discretion to take smart risks that had been key to the lab's success has eroded over the years as more and more of its budget has become restricted by directives. Now, we know that all companies must invest in R&D to stay competitive. Similarly, to get the most out of our foreign assistance, Congress could consider directing a modest pool of unearmarked funds for R&D, along with flexible hiring authorities to bring in forward-thinking experts. Finally, USAID is one of the best development institutions on the planet. Yet even the most dedicated staff are hampered in their ambitions by excessively burdensome rules, regulations, and risk aversion, which the ranking member referenced. I would encourage Congress to increase flexibility by shifting towards measuring results rather than predefined activities. Focus on what you want accomplished rather than how it's accomplished. This will unleash the ingenuity of the talented staff to get the job done and more. One concrete step in this direction could be to ask that a small percentage of all large programs be set aside for innovation. That is, finding ways to make the bulk of the funding go even further. When I joined the federal government, one leader shared something with me that really stuck. He said, in government, you can't get fired for doing nothing. You can only get fired for doing something. In other words, don't stick out your neck or take any risks. The problems the world faces today require agility, creativity, and smart risk-taking. qualities America holds in abundance as an entrepreneurial nation with deep reservoirs of talent. I would respectfully ask the subcommittee to send a strong message that we do want our development agencies to stick their necks out in order to secure America's health and prosperity. Thank you again for the invitation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. And I'll now call on Ms. Swain for her testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Maliatakis, and members of the subcommittee. I'm so pleased to see you having convened this hearing on maximizing results in development through innovation. I'd like to recognize and congratulate you on the creation of this subcommittee. The work you're doing here is vitally important, made even more so in the current global crisis, and I'm glad to join everyone here today. Accelerating innovation in development is vital for building back the progress lost or at best paused by the pandemic. And because aid budgets are only a fraction of the resources needed to recover lost ground and equitably grow the global middle class, we also need to get more capital off of the sidelines. I'm the CEO of the Global Innovation Fund, or GIF, which was announced in 2013 by the British Prime Minister and the Usaid Administrator as a multilateral vehicle for investing in development innovation, making early stage debt and equity investments, as well as grants. Innovation in development is important because it allows scarce resources to go further. It compresses timelines to meet development goals. While this was true before the pandemic, it's particularly important now. As Anne May said, innovation offers significant social returns, often greater than traditional aid models. As an example, just 5 of GIF's early innovations have generated over $53 million in social benefits directly attributable to GIF's investment. The social value being created by GIF's current portfolio, even after adjusting for risk, is some 180 times greater than the social value that would be created by deploying the same amount of money as cash transfers to people who live on less than $5 a day. The benefits of innovation can best be captured by the application of 2 related policy principles: measuring impact and using that information for investment decision-making, and strategically structuring investment vehicles to create the right balance between flexibility and accountability in deploying capital. My remarks consider each of these principles in turn. Just as commercial investors quantify their financial returns, innovation in development requires quantifying the social returns on investment when making funding decisions. It's the potential for this social value that justifies the investment in early stage companies that are building the markets they sell into. It's also this pursuit of social value that allows for exit when private capital is ready to come to the table, and recycling returns for further impact. Taken together, estimates of social benefits allow you to assess the value of not just individual deals, but portfolios, at a time when innovation must address disparate but interrelated development challenges, including pandemic recovery, climate change, and gender equality. More development impact can also be delivered through financing vehicles that have the flexibility to use a range of instruments, including equity, debt, and grants. The choice needs to depend on the capital needs of the innovator. One way to do this is by working through independent intermediaries that can engage directly with the private sector. Governments can require strong environmental and social due diligence without weighing in on any individual deal in particular. Transparency is also essential for accountability. USAID agencies have an excellent track record here, but the opportunity now is to push further the boundaries on what can be expected when engaging the private sector, sharing information publicly on expected financial and social returns, at least at the portfolio level. It's possible to prudently invest in a portfolio of early stage, high social return innovations by linking funding amounts to the probability of successfully delivering impact. Governance requirements can tie an investor's financial exposure to evidence of impact and potential for scale. Finally, use multilateral partnerships. When like-minded governments come together to back innovation, each government has limited exposure to the portfolio's risk, relative to if they were to go it alone, while leveraging each other's funding. In sum, taking smart risk, protecting taxpayer dollars, and generating evidence can drive a virtuous cycle. You've addressed some of this already, Mr. Chairman, in previous bills, and I thank you for your leadership in international development assistance. In my written testimony, I've submitted more detailed additional recommendations. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Swain. Thank you for your testimony. I now turn it over to Mr. Leo for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Malliotakis, and other members of the subcommittee. It's a real honor and privilege to be here with you today. I have 5 main points that I want to make today. First, technological innovation has advanced tremendously in the last 5 years, driven by machine learning, satellite imagery, and cloud computing. These enabling factors have spawned a complete revolution in things like geospatial technology. Second, companies like Frame are already applying these new technologies to drive improved programmatic targeting, monitoring, and resource efficiencies in ways that were previously unimaginable. Now, development agencies have faced huge long-standing challenges when trying to develop, target, and monitor billions of dollars in country programming. Typically, they've had to rely on national or regional statistics for things like educational attainment, or child marriage, or access to electricity. Yet this kind of an approach assumes that all communities look the same across the target country, which we know is just wildly incorrect. With new technologies like Frame, it's now possible to map these same kind of development indicators like child marriage prevalence or malaria prevalence down to a single square kilometer grid across an entire country in a matter of days, not months or years. For instance, powered by Frame software, we produced hundreds of data layers in a matter of days spanning dozens of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to map COVID-19 risk factors down to the neighborhood level. This data and these maps fed directly into the Kenyan president's National Action Plan, or helped the Ghanaian government target very specific services to underserved neighborhoods with particularly acute transmission risks. Now, USAID has yet to update its traditional way of operating to systematically leverage these kinds of new technologies for impact and efficiency across its entire global portfolio, which leads me to my final 3 points. Third, USAID remains largely focused on incentivizing ad hoc or non-commercial interventions that have a very hard time scaling across its entire program portfolio. Now, it's clear USAID has done some very exciting things and has supported very exciting innovation and intervention. However, most of these efforts have been channeled through challenge grants, academic experiments, or niche projects that focus on innovation on the margins or very, very specific types of applications. They rarely scale, either because they're one-off experiments or the sponsored organization doesn't have the resources or the incentives to build a highly scalable solution. This is particularly true when the recipients are NGOs or academic institutions that are incentivized to cover personnel costs and far less incentivized to make the capital investments that will transform a promising prototype into a truly global capability. Fourth, USAID should learn from how the Defense Department and the intelligence community are ambitiously funding and streamlining technological innovation to address mission requirements. These agencies have a range of transformative programs and vehicles that match commercially viable AI/ML innovations to core mission requirements. These programs deploy billions of dollars each and every single year to find promising new technologies in the private sector and match them specifically to warfighter and intelligence analyst requirements. Fifth and last, USAID also should systematically incorporate new technological approaches in its multi-year program and project contracting processes. Now, USAID has a very well-established process for awarding large multi-year contracts. Challenge is that Frame and other new technology companies are often stalled in delivering to maximum effect and to maximum capability within these types of multi-year bilateral awards. Our scalable solutions are locked in these subcontracts in these bilateral programs, and like I said, are often suboptimally utilized. If USAID more clearly communicated demand for these types of cross-country, portfolio-wide technologies, both more broadly as well as within individual RFPs, this would help address this structural challenge. In conclusion, there's a tremendous and extremely timely opportunity to harness the massive technological advances that have occurred in the last 3 to 5 years to help streamline commercially viable technologies in ways that deliver improved USAID targeting, impact, and cost efficiencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Leo. Thank you for your testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the hybrid format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between majority and minority members. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And also, sometimes we give a little bit of extra time to both the witnesses and the committee members for their questions, but as you all know, we're in the middle, or we're about to start a series of votes, so I'm going to try very hard to keep everybody on time. So I would ask both the witnesses and the committee members to be cognizant of the clock, the 5-minute clock, for the witnesses or for the committee members. If you're with us virtually, make sure that you're on the grid view so that you can see that 5-minute clock. And if folks go too far over it, don't think me rude, but I'll cut you off because we've got votes going on. All right? So I'll start by recognizing myself. One of the major challenges impacting innovation is the reorganization of USAID. That eliminated the development lab in its prior form, but put many of its key components in other parts of the bureaucracy. I wanted to ask Ms. Chang, how do you see the reorganization of USAID impacting its ability to innovate, and what should Congress and the new administration keep in mind to ensure innovation continues to be prioritized at USAID?
Thank you for your question, Chairman. The reorganization is still relatively new, but I believe that it still preserves the vast bulk of the lab's functions within the new Innovation, Technology, and Research Hub. I have no reason to believe that this new structure can't be equally successful, but it is still early days. What I think is important for us to look at, though, is whether in the new structure or the old structure, to look at how are we going to meet a dual challenge. One is to mainstream the successful approaches that the lab has pioneered and that exist across USAID so that we benefit from them across all of our programming, while also preserving the space and the flexibility to identify those next generation of breakthroughs. Sometimes that can be difficult within the same organization because there's a tension between working with the rest of the agency and integrating with programs and taking a step aside to be able to have that blue sky thinking and experimentation space.
Well, thank you. I want to ask Ms. Swain a question also about the Global Innovation Fund. The Global Innovation Fund was set up in partnership with the Global Development Lab and with the help of the government of the United Kingdom. In fact, the United States continues to hold a board seat in your organization. I understand that the United States, after providing an initial amount of funding, has not committed to support the Global Innovation Fund with funding, even though our partner countries continue to do so. Ms. Swain, can you walk us through the history of the fund and how the United States can better support the fund?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to reflect on the history of GIF. The Global Innovation Fund was announced in 2013 by David Cameron, then the Prime Minister of the UK, and Raj Shah in his role as Usaid Administrator. Building on the successful track record of DIV within the Global Development Lab and inspired by that, but deliberately created to be a multilateral investment vehicle that could also engage directly with the private sector. So we have thus far deployed about $100 million in capital in a range of debt and grant and equity investments. One way to think about GIF is as operating in a sort of nexus in between DIV and challenge grants that come out of USAID and the US DFC. So we are an early stage venture investor with the ability to follow on fund companies in our portfolio with the hope that they could eventually graduate to DFIs like the DFC. The initial commitment from USAID to GIF was a 5-year commitment, which expired in September. And we continue to look forward to working with USAID under some new form of agreement or a new form of partnership that reflects the relative maturity of GIF and, as Anne May was speaking about, new thinking within the agency about how to fund innovation. One of the recommendations that I make in my testimony is that we would encourage you to think about authorizing funding mechanisms that normalize the flexibility that's needed to support innovation. Supporting an investment fund like GIF is just different than supporting an implementing program, which is what processes at USAID are really optimized to do. Of course, flexibility without transparency and evidence can invite problems. But we think that there is a way and that there's a track record at GIF of marrying flexibility with a focus on evidence and transparency that allows for appropriate accountability in deploying taxpayer dollars for innovation.
Thank you, Ms. Swain. All right, I'll turn over to Ranking Member Maliotakis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to focus on 2 things. Some of the key challenges that we're facing in getting private sector partners. And Mr. Leo talked about this a little bit, and I was wondering if he could help elaborate how we can try to get them to work more with USAID. I know that the creation of the private sector engagement policy and engagement hub improved collaboration, but what more can be done? And anyone's free to answer. I just know Mr. Leo had focused on that specifically.
Thank you very much. It's a great question, or a couple of questions. I'd add a little bit more color, a little bit more detail. We're very supportive of the new private sector engagement hub within the Bureau of Development, Democracy, and Innovation. It has a very strong potential to bring systems level thinking to put in place the organizational requirements and capacity that would better and more effectively engage with companies like Frame. It's still relatively early, but we view it as a good step, and we've already had some interaction and positive interaction at that. The pieces that I would humbly recommend have to do with ambition and flexibility in the vehicles, and to bifurcate between localized innovation and intervention for delivering particular kinds of services and truly global new technologies that can be applied across the entire portfolio. So a couple of really powerful programs that I alluded to from the Defense Department are the Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR programs, or some of the funding that's in the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, or JAIC, or even InQtech, where they are making a portfolio of bets where they are specifically empowering companies to identify end users that have a specific pain point that is systemic in nature, and to be able to prototype and then, if successful, scale a solution for them. The Air Force, Army, and other DoD agencies are investing a lot of money in this. And those programs make DIV, which is a great effort, look very, very niche, very small, and not applied across the entire portfolio. So I think there's pieces from outside of USAID that really could be pulled in if Congress wanted to support the same level of ambition to harnessing the technology that has just rapidly transformed the private sector in a handful of years, and bring that tech, bring those solutions into government for impact and efficiency in very specific ways.
Great. Thank you. And the second issue I wanted to bring up was ensuring that, all these investments are measured, right? That we want to make sure that particularly when we're using taxpayer money, we want to make sure we measure the metrics, measure results for effectiveness. And so this is open to everyone. What processes are put in place right now to deliver the metrics, and what would you recommend that should be added to ensure that we are measuring the metrics, ensuring that what we're investing in is effective?
I would just double down on what Ben said earlier, and also say that part of how we can help the private sector be better partners with the private sector is to allow greater flexibility, so that because technology moves very, very quickly, and when we have monolithic programs that are designed and planned 5 years in advance, it's very difficult for us to anticipate the technologies that will be available a few years down the road. And so offering that flexibility will be a better way to partner with the private sector. And when it comes to results, I think, as I mentioned in my earlier testimony, I think the private sector is also better if we talk about the results that we want to achieve versus all of the activities that we're expecting to take place along the way, so that we have, again, the flexibility to seek out the best solutions as we learn along the way.
I would just add, in our experience, making sure that the private sector is accountably held, is tracking and held accountable for delivering results is actually not as much of a challenge. There's, if it's delivering a product or delivering a service, typically that's going to be milestone based. And so you're just not going to get paid if you don't deliver on what you said you're going to do. It's more of an issue if we're thinking about equity or debt investments. And
Mr. Leo, I gotta cut you off there. We gotta go over to Ms. Jacobs.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. It's great to see some of you that I've had the pleasure of working with before. I wanted to drill down even more on this question of measurement and metrics, particularly as we are trying to measure results, some of which it's hard to measure the progress until much after the program or initiative has been conducted. So how do you think we should be thinking about measuring that progress, and what kinds of metrics should Congress be asking for so that we can both make sure we're providing flexibility but also accountability, and also giving that space for the longer term programming outcomes? I guess Ms. Chang.
Alex, why don't you go first, and I'll fill in after you.
Well, one piece of advice I think I would urge us all to reflect on is going beyond metrics that are about people reached. It's simply quite difficult to interpret what it means if you reach somebody with a radio message versus if you save someone's life. And when we are building portfolios of development innovation, you've got to find ways to push towards having apples to apples comparisons. And you have to have standards for updating these measures of impact. So both Anne May and I mentioned in our opening remarks measures of social return on investment that you can do as ex post calculations. It's possible to predict those in advance and update those calculations as you learn more about the performance of the particular innovation. GIF has a tool that we've developed precisely for this that we use to calibrate whether the predicted and estimated social value of an innovation makes sense ex ante, and then you can update that to determine whether additional capital should be invested in the project. There's a similar tool at the DFC called Impact Quotient, which I think shows a great deal of promise. And certainly the MCC has been a real leader in doing economic return calculations. So I think ambition is warranted here, despite the fact that it will require modeling and then updating over time.
And Representative, I think you're right. This is one of the biggest challenges for innovation, why it's so much harder to innovate for global development than it is in the private sector many times, is that the results we seek are not as simple as an e-commerce transaction where you know the next second whether it's taken place, but we're looking at breaking generational cycles of poverty or governance or things that take a long time to realize. And how we go about that at agencies like USAID is we develop a theory of change. We do one thing, it leads to another thing, it leads to another thing that eventually leads to the result we want. And so, for example, if what we're trying to do is increase the incomes of poor rural farmers, it can take years maybe to see if we've increased their income. But if some of the things that we're doing to do so are, for example, to train them on better farming techniques, to provide them with fertilizer, we can look immediately and test those earlier linkages in the theories of change to see, are the farmers adopting these new farming techniques? Are they using the fertilizer? If they're doing so, then we're far more likely to see that impact over time. And so by measuring the progress in those earlier linkages in those theories of change that we create, we can see if we're on track and we can start to optimize and learn and improve on those earlier linkages so that we ultimately are more likely to hit our goals.
Thank you. And then this question is for Ms. Swain. I wanted to drill a little more down on the blended funding models, and in particular, what specific examples or initiatives you can give on which kinds of layers have been successful, and exactly who and what were layered in that blended funding model in 30 seconds.
I'll be very brief, yes. Typically, GIF can act as the first institutional investor in a company with convertible debt or early stage equity. And then what we seek to do is, in some cases, to bring on more commercial capital directly in the capital stack, or help a company get to the next round of funding, which at that time, commercial capital could come in. So there's a variety of approaches that we can use here.
Thank you. All right, we'll go to Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on Congresswoman Jacobs's line of questioning with a couple of questions. First of all, I appreciate that it's difficult to test and quantify, particularly in real time. On the other hand, funding year after year, if you can't test, becomes a question. So one of the questions is, how many of the $100 million of investments can you show us that are available, transparent, had a goal at the beginning, the goal has been tested, and the goal has achieved? In other words, how many of those examples could I go online today and see so that I could genuinely evaluate, let's assume I'm the angel investor, that not that I haven't lost money in some places, not that there aren't some that are still to be understood and tested. But when you say, well, we've gotten this $5 return for each dollar, where do I go to find the $500 million return on 100 million, which really is probably a 15 or 20 fold on those, since many of them either haven't been tested or have failed?
I think that's for me, Representative.
Yes.
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 Thank you very much. So one thing I'll begin by saying is that there's a nonprofit called Publish What You Fund that has a development finance institution transparency initiative underway. And they've set out best practices for transparency for DFIs or institutions like GIF that invest directly in private companies. And so we've taken it upon ourselves to meet the Publish What You Fund standards for transparency. So for every investment that we've made, it's available to see on the website, on our website, what our investment thesis was at the time. At the portfolio level, we also publish estimates of social rates of return. You can't necessarily do that on a company by company basis because there's proprietary data there, but you can see it at the portfolio level. And I think this is achievable for DFIs in general, if GIF can do it as well.
Well, so, let me follow up because you've given me the first answer. Let me try to get the second question in because it drills down. When we look within the portfolio, and I understand there's proprietary information, but as, if you will, one of your investors, how do I see that you're choosing to reinvest in the winners and choosing to abandon or reduce your future investment or change your future investment in those that have a lower social return? And then obviously, where do I find the calculation of the social returns? Because without drilling that down, it really is of no value to know that, you know, everyone I know invested in Facebook, but nobody wants to tell you how many other investments they did that do not equal or equal or exceed in losses what they made in Facebook. But they all talk to you about the winnings at the track.
So that's a helpful analogy to keeping us all honest. So there's two ways, I think, to look at how savvy we've been as investors. One is to look at exits and those as case studies around when we've chosen to exit from investments and how and when we did that, what kind of financial returns we've made, but also what choices did we make to make sure we didn't crowd out private capital. So in my written testimony, I give an example of a company in Uganda that we invested in with convertible debt. And then when they raised an initial equity round, ultimately, it was oversubscribed with commercial capital. And we did not participate in the round and allowed ourselves to be bought out. In that case, we made a 1.6x return on the initial capital that we invested on financial returns, and then social return on top of that.
Well, let's hope you get a lot more of those. I'm going to ask one final exit question because I know that there are many others waiting. When we look at investments made elsewhere, I'm going to give you a hypothetical because it's only half hypothetical. We're currently still putting $1 million or $2 million every year, apparently, into peacekeeping in Cyprus for, figuring under USAID. If I were to give you that $1 million that is essentially keeping a warm pot against this European Union member developed nation that still, in fact, we're investing in, where would you put that incremental $1 million, and could you fully deploy it?
Let's get that answer for the record because we're about 35 seconds.
That'd be
over.
fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll go to Brad Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we talk about innovation, there are many different types, just there are many different buildings at a university. If we start at the science, technology, and engineering building, we see that there's a lot that we can do here in the United States that has tremendous development potential around the world. The best example of that is new rice seeds and the entire green revolution. And yet there's a tendency for those involved in international development to be people who study policy and international affairs, who want to go out to the field and actually see the farmers they help. And I would hope to see more of our international development focused on science done here that can affect the entire world, especially the developing world. Another part of engineering is to develop new transportation systems that can help bring aid to very remote areas in times of crisis, particularly when roads and ports are often destroyed by natural disasters. I've become a helium head, seeing the advantages someday of having blimps being able to deliver aid to the most remote areas. That can be done if they have buoyancy control. But the greatest scientific crisis we face is still the COVID virus, where it's critical for our world leadership, for our economy, and for our development goals that we get the entire world vaccinated. And that's, of course, critical for the safety of Americans as well, since everyone who gets infected is a chance for this disease to replicate and mutate and perhaps come back in another form. Unfortunately, to illustrate the problems we face here, our COVID people here in the United States are refusing to do research on how to use less vaccine serum, particularly for those under age 55. There's a lot of literature that says it would work. And their attitude is, well, by the time we get the results, it won't help any Americans because they'll all be vaccinated. A underinvestment in scientific research, a international development approach that doesn't focus on science, and science that focuses only on helping the United States doesn't get us where we want to go. A second area that's more relevant to my other committee assignment on capital markets is that we need to see funds that invest in poor countries and that are available particularly for pension investments. We here in the federal government have in effect a 401k, we call it TSP, and you can invest in foreign stocks, but only pretty much the European Union and Japan in one international fund. Those who wanted to use their own investment dollars to see greater development in the developing world are not allowed to do so if they're federal employees, and that's pretty much true throughout pension investing in 401ks. Ms. Wayne, I've become familiar with the work of the GIF, the Global Innovation Fund, and I commend you on that work. I wonder if you have learned lessons in dealing with COVID around the world that would be useful to the U.S. government as we continue to battle this disease.
Thank you very much for that question. Certainly, at the beginning of 2020, it became apparent to us that companies that were in our portfolio were really going to face a liquidity crunch in 2020 through no fault of their own. Companies were at risk, not because of sort of creative destruction of well-functioning markets, but instead things that would destroy real value creation. So we worked hard to pivot to providing bridge financing to companies in our portfolio to help protect the social value that they were on track to creating. And it's actually a good example of why flexibility is valuable. We were able to pivot towards these kind of bridge financing rounds that we hadn't anticipated would be needed. And we're also able to pivot towards funding innovation for COVID response because our resources are relatively flexible. So we had maybe our busiest year ever in 2020, very much, leaning into being part of addressing COVID as opposed to sort of taking a defensive crouch. One thing we've seen is that actually some companies, it was a good forcing mechanism for them to think more about using mobile platforms, using technology, using machine learning in ways to get out to reach people when we're all really hunkered down. And so there's some innovations in our portfolio that I think are going to be stronger for having weathered the COVID storm. So that was a good lesson for us, and that I think is widely applicable, building on some of what Mr. Leo testified about earlier.
Thank you, Ms.
I have
Lane.
so many questions, but so little time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. We're going to recess the committee for about 5 to 10 minutes, the subcommittee, just because votes are going on, and we should be right back.
The hearing will reconvene, and I now recognize Representative Houlihan for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much to the witnesses here today. I have a couple of prepared questions, but I actually have some questions as a result of your opening remarks. And my first one is for Ms. Chang. I was hoping in your opening remarks you gave such a beautiful and compelling vision for what it was that we could be doing in the area of innovation. But I think that sometimes pictures also tell a good story. Can you give some examples of ideas that have come to fruition because of this idea of innovation that you were helpful in beginning? And also, could you talk a little bit about the development lab, the Global Development Lab, and its difference, if any, from things like the JAKE on the DoD side? Is it just a matter of scale, or is there something different there that we could be enhancing?
Thank you for your questions, Representative. There's so many examples. I'll just give a few very briefly, just to give a sense of the breadth. I think some of the examples are examples of new ideas that we never would have come across, like the ODON device, which is a assisted device for assisted birth that could replace forceps and become much safer to use in developing countries. That was designed by an Argentinian car mechanic in response to one of our grand challenges. We also have another example of something called real gardening that was designed by a South African 17-year-old woman, which is she came up with this idea of a strip that you would place seeds in order to allow people who are having small gardens both conserve water, because they would know only to water where the seeds were planted, and also know things like how to space the seeds, includes the fertilizer and so forth. There's also sort of more mature innovations where we're not just coming up with the early stage ideas, but some later stage things like Vision Spring, that's bringing eyeglasses to people around the world, where there's over 1 billion people who need eyeglasses and still don't have them, even though this was an invention that came around hundreds of years ago. And Pratham, which was mentioned earlier, is also another innovation that the lab has invested in, really looking at how do we scale this. And it's an intervention that is potentially very applicable in this time where a lot of children are falling behind on their schooling. In terms of the DoD, I'm not that familiar specifically with that program at the DoD, but what I would say is, compared to something like DARPA at the DoD, the lab has been certainly much, much smaller. And also the DARPA, I think, is looking much further out in the long term in sort of more the pure research realm, whereas the lab is more in the sort of applied research space, where we're really looking at practical solutions that could make a difference in the next few years. So hopefully that answers your questions.
Yeah, thank you. And that kind of transitions me over to Mr. Leo. I also serve on the Armed Services Committee and have served in the military in acquisitions, amongst other things. And I was sort of stunned by your ask for us to model what we're doing after the DoD on the HVAC side, because we certainly have some innovative ideas on the DoD in that area, but only relatively recently. And then you spoke a little bit in a previous question about the JAKE as an example, and SIBR, and was wondering if that's the kind of thing you mean when you're saying we could take a page out of the DoD, or is it the kind of programs that we have that are almost like Shark Tank, that are things you're looking for? How could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by that?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So specifically, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to apply something like a SIBR, where there is a direct linkage with a sequenced and milestone-based approach that matches really promising new tech, brings it into a DoD environment to address a very specific workflow or mission pain point. And if it's successful, then it is designed to sequence and scale over time into a program of record. There, on the DIV side, there's aspects of that, but not in a way that has a global portfolio or global mission involved with the same level of scale and intent to bring in commercially viable approaches. So those are some of the things that actually, despite some of the DoD procurement challenges and inefficiencies, I think there's some places where there's real powerful innovation and harnessing of private tech that could be applied.
Thank you. And then I think for both of you, one of the things that I think is consistent both on the DoD side and on this side as well, on the HVAC side, with these ideas and innovations is the operationalizing of them and the fact that we don't necessarily value resources or sending resources to scaling ideas, but rather value other things in the ways that we allocate funds. How can we be better at directing money to the operationalization, of ideas that come out of innovation? And I guess maybe if I could direct that to Ms. Chang first.
Yes, I know we're short on time, so I'll be brief here. I think it fundamentally comes to the incentive system within the agency and within our implementing partners. When we incentivize people to create plans and execute on those plans over several years, there's a tendency to take the sort of traditional solutions and apply them because they're tried and true, and we know that we'll be able to deliver them. I think that if we shift more to driving performance, demanding that we improve performance over the course of a program, and really holding programs accountable for results, then there's going to be much more of a demand for both innovation tools and the innovations themselves.
Mr. Leo, do you have anything to contribute?
Yes, I do. It's a great question as well. I think there's always going to be a need for localized solutions because the nature of some of our development challenges need to reflect complex local settings. There are a range of issues that are and tech enabled on identifying target beneficiaries, being able to have iterative data collection, for instance, that are applicable across almost every single program or project across USAID's portfolio. And we're not focusing in on the synergies that can be achieved with those kinds of activities. And those are some of the places where there's been the most innovation in a very short period of time that we're just not utilizing. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do it much better, more efficiently, that will also lead to more impact and cost savings.
Thank you. And with my final, or one of my final questions, this is for Ms. Zwane. One of the SDG goals is to achieve by 2030 gender equality, which seems like a very vast and grand goal. How can innovation, in your opinion, play a role in supporting that goal of global gender equality?
Representative, if I could, I would love to take the first stab at this. This is an area where my company is very active, and we've done some very exciting work, including some examples that are included in my testimony, mapping child marriage prevalence across space and over time, being able to pinpoint where we see the greatest levels of that prevalence and be able to understand the community dynamics so that we're able to move the needle on this scourge for women and young girls. And those are some of the examples where I think we can take a very laser focused approach to identify where there is the greatest concentration of inequity, lack of opportunity for women and girls, whether it's educational or on the employment participation side, and then be able to develop very focused programs, initiatives, and policies to move the needle in an iterative way. We're actually doing some really exciting work on this right now that's focused on Kenya, South Africa, and India in the context of COVID-19 specifically, and how the disruption to women and girls has been so concentrated and intense. And over the next month or two, we're going to be putting out some really cutting edge work on this. We'd love to be able to share that with you and your staff and keep you apprised on that nexus between tech and promoting gender equality.
Yeah, I'd love that. I'm one of the few STEM people in the Congress, and my mom is actually a GIS person, so it sounds like I'd have a lot to talk to you about and would love to follow up with you with my staff. Ms. Zwane, do you have anything as well with that particular question about gender equality?
I think what we've just heard being described is a really excellent example of the potential for innovation in this space. We are also ourselves very interested in backing education programs that involve both boys and girls in thinking about gender roles as they're entering into adolescence, and thinking about multiplicative ways to scale those models through franchising and other approaches there, so that you can have really big, bold goals and not be limited by the capacity of individual NGOs. We're interested in programs that partner directly with government and get into government schools. One thing I would add that would be different is we need to think also about measuring gender impacts for their as an end to their own, not just as a means to the end of economic development. And we've recently launched at GIF a toolkit to facilitate that kind of gender lens investing. And we're learning more about how to do that, of course, but I think all of us can challenge ourselves to measure these kinds of impacts directly, just as we want to measure other economic outcomes.
Thank you. And with my final question, I'm not certain to whom to aim this at, because I think you all probably have great ideas in this, but I think there's been a lot of conversation about measuring what matters, and making sure that we have metrics to measure performance. But in the area of something like democracy and governance, I feel as though it's pretty hard to understand how to do that. How can you measure something, innovations in those areas, if at all? And perhaps I'll ask Mr. Leo first.
Well, it is challenging. It's very complex. One of the things that we're really excited about, including at Frame, is we've built new capabilities that actually parallel what I was talking about before, that allow us to pinpoint target beneficiaries or categories of people, say people that lack primary education or lack access to electricity at a hyperlocal level. We have now built capabilities that allow us to estimate at localized level what people think and how they behave. So we're able to actually rapidly collect information on deepening establishment of democratic values, democratic beliefs, as well as beliefs around national or international issues that can then feed into some of our programs in an iterative way, whether that's in collaboration with NDI and IRI or USAID or other programs. So it is a complex issue, but there are new technology-driven tools that allow us to be able to operate with much more complete information about localized dynamics, because we know politics and democracy starts at a local level and then builds up. And so we've built tools that actually mirror that.
Thank you. I've run out of time, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. All right, well, everybody has asked a first round of questions, and so I'm just going to see now if anybody's got a second round question really quick, and I know Representative Jacobs has one or two. I'll turn it over to her.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses again. I wanted to follow up on the question that my colleague, Representative Houlihan, just asked on the democracy and governance. And I think a lot of times it's as hard to get people to think about how to do innovation differently as people in the innovation and tech space to think about how these challenges are actually quite different. That it's similar to how it's not just in e-commerce where you can measure the transaction. We also have to think about the human impacts of all of these different things and risks that we're taking and things that we're trying. So I was wondering, Mr. Leo, if you could talk a bit about how your organization is thinking about the potential misuses of this data, or how governments might use that kind of pinpointed information for ways we wouldn't want. And then, Ms. Chang, if you could talk a bit about how we can make sure, as we're working with private sector partners, that we're incorporating the kind of human-centered considerations that we know our aid workers are very adept at.
Those are fantastic questions. Let me answer as directed to me in two ways. First, on privacy and the sanctity and anonymity of data. The way that we have built our software that harnesses machine learning, georeference data, imagery, and other sets of data it is built-in privacy and anonymity of individuals' data at entry and at design. So we're even if we wanted to, we're not able to identify who is the respondent that is feeding into our models. So we've taken it very, very seriously in just our regular operations. But on the second part of the question, in terms of other actors, there's some things that I think are really relevant. First, we are also able to understand at a hyperlocal level what kind of information people consume. What television channels are they watching? What radio programs? What kinds of social media apps are they using? Again, at that community aggregate level across space and across time. And so we're able to get a better sense of how disinformation, how misinformation deliberately executed by certain actors may transmit across a community, a region, a country, to be able to understand how do we actually combat that? How do we reach counter messages? How do we reach the maximum number of people with counter messages? Whether it's about safety of vaccines or whether it's about democratic principles. There's ways to be able to target those kinds of information in ways that reflect the information environment that just wasn't really possible a handful of years ago. So we're really excited about this space as well.
And Representative, I think these are great questions. And one of the things I've learned in having the privilege of having worked across the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector is that each of these sectors has a lot of unique assets to bring, but also limitations. And so what I found is that magic happens at the intersection of sectors. So when you ask the question of how can we make sure that the private sector, which may have incredible expertise in technology, for example, but may not be as versed in some of the nuances and culture and the realities of some of the environments that we work in, I think partnership is really important. Partnership with agencies like USAID and also partnerships with INGOs that have their feet on the ground and really understand those local communities. I think another thing we need to think about when we're deploying technologies and deploying any new innovation, in fact, is that with anything new, there can be unintended consequences. And that is something we really need to be thoughtful of and cognizant of, because the last thing we want to do is to make things worse. And that's one of the reasons that I think with any innovation, we actually want to start small. Even though we may have big ambitions, the smaller we start, the more control we have over the environment, and we're able to detect if there are unintended consequences and address those as quickly as possible, as well as be more nimble and agile and iterating and improving. And once we find something that works and we are confident in it, then we can really drive forward and scale. And this is essentially, if you see how we test vaccines, we start out with a small group of people to make sure that it's safe before we go and put the pedal to the metal and get it out to everyone who could benefit.
Thank you. Can I do one more? And then along the same lines, how can we in Congress help the development agencies be able to incentivize this kind of risk-taking that we know is needed for innovation, while also having a do-no-harm approach to that kind of risk, because we know it's actually not us who's bearing the brunt of it?
This is one of the reasons that one of the recommendations I have is to create an innovation window within all of our large programs, and then to hold those programs to account to driving their performance and improving their performance over time. In that small innovation window, it's going to be a tiny fraction of the whole program, because we do want to start small. We do want to try some more speculative things to see what works, see what sticks, improve on those things. And then once those things really show traction, then we can mainstream them across the rest of a large program. A lot of these programs last for 5 years or even more. And so there's a lot of time within those 5 years to not just take a static program that might have been designed even a few years earlier, but to be dynamic and to be learning constantly and to expect that in year 5, we are making dramatically more impact, being dramatically more cost effective than we are in year 1. And right now, those expectations aren't really built into the
All right, y'all, we're going to recess for a few minutes while we figure out the technology hiccup here.
And it would allow opportunities for companies like mine to be able to provide value and bring some of our capabilities to scale in programs that are pre-existing that we might not have already partnered with a large prime contractor 2 years ago, 3 years ago, which basically locked that multi-year trajectory in place that Ann's talking about. So if there was that built-in flexibility, it would really crowd in new ideas, new solutions that could be tested out and scaled if successful or discontinued if not. I think it's a wonderful idea.
All right, thank you, Representative Jacobs. And that concludes our questions for our witnesses. And so I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us for this subcommittee's hearing. Thank you to the witnesses. Your testimony was important and impactful and will help guide the rest of our work in this term. As we've heard from our witnesses, the United States government and our partners have a solid foundation of work to build off to advance innovation in foreign assistance. What we need is to continue prioritizing innovation, investing in the capabilities, authorities, and leadership at USAID to develop new ideas and to support their widespread adoption. The subcommittee will consider the issues discussed today in pursuit of our oversight and legislative responsibilities. Thank you all. With that, our hearing is adjourned.